I will sleep with you tonight. Don't be jealous if I have children with other women. Hi, my beautiful family of readers and storytelling enthusiasts. Your caring hearts and thoughtful feedback mean more than I can express. Yesterday, as I lay awake thinking about a minor mistake in my story, I was touched by how much this community matters to me. I worried that such mistakes might drive you away, but your continued support and gentle guidance show the true strength of our connection. Let me share this prayer from my heart to yours. May our hearts remain open to learning from each other's stories. May we find strength in sharing our experiences together. May kindness guide our words and understanding fill our thoughts. And may the bonds we forge through storytelling bring light to darker days. For every reader who takes time to share their thoughts, for every heart that connects with these tales of hope, for every soul that finds comfort in these words, we give thanks for this community of caring minds. May our stories continue to inspire and uplift, teaching us about love, redemption, and growth. Let understanding bridge our differences and compassion guide our journey together. The love I hold in my heart for this community cannot be measured in words alone. Your presence, your feedback, and your engagement make each story more meaningful. I'd love to hear from you. Are you enjoying these stories? What lessons have you taken from them? Who inspires you as a storyteller on YouTube? Most importantly, I want to know if my work satisfies you and touches your hearts. Every word I write carries the hope of bringing joy, understanding, and emotional connection to your lives. Let's continue this journey together, moving forward with love and emotion, building bridges through stories that touch hearts and transform lives. With deep appreciation and care, Mr. Peter. Chapter 1. The Encounter. Princeton. Harvey's reflection stared back at him from his penthouse window, a man at the pinnacle of success yet haunted by emptiness. The setting sun painted Manhattan's skyline in hues of amber and gold, a view worth millions that had long since lost its ability to impress him. At 35, his empire spanned continents. But tonight, the silence of his success was deafening. His fingers traced the cold glass, following the outline of a distant skyscraper he'd acquired last month. Harvey Industries' latest trophy, another notch in his belt of achievements. The deal had made headlines. Harvey's golden touch strikes again. Yet here he stood, alone in a penthouse larger than most homes, surrounded by art pieces worth more than what most people earned in a lifetime. "Mr. Harvey?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, disrupting his reverie. "The car is waiting. The Metropolitan Museum Gala begins in 40 minutes. Princeton adjusted his bow tie in the reflection, a custom piece from his favorite atelier in Milan. The face that looked back at him was striking, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that commanded respect, and a jawline that featured regularly in business magazines. Time had been kind to him, or perhaps it was the expensive skincare regimen his image consultant insisted upon. "Another night, another performance," he murmured, reaching for his Patek Philippe watch. The timepiece had cost more than a small car, but in his world, such extravagance was expected. He slipped on his tailored Tom Ford jacket, each movement precise and practiced. The private elevator descended silently, its polished walls reflecting his perfect posture. Princeton had mastered the art of appearance, every gesture calculated, every smile measured. It was a game he played expertly, turning charm into currency, desire into deals. His Rolls-Royce Phantom waited at the curb, Gregory, his driver of 7 years, holding the door with practiced deference. "Good evening, Mr. Harvey." "Evening, Gregory." Princeton settled into the leather interior, inhaling the familiar scent of success. The Met, and tried to avoid Fifth Avenue traffic. The car glided into the Manhattan night, a bubble of luxury floating through the city's chaos. Princeton reviewed the gala's guest list on his tablet. CEOs, hedge fund managers, old money families desperately clinging to relevance. He knew their weaknesses, their ambitions, their prices. Everyone had a price. It was the first lesson his father had taught him. The Metropolitan Museum loomed ahead, its classical facade illuminated against the darkening sky. A red carpet stretched up the iconic steps, photographers' flashes creating a storm of artificial lightning. Princeton checked his phone one last time. 3 missed calls from his latest acquisitions board, 2 messages from women whose names he barely remembered, and an email from his publicist about tomorrow's charity photo op. Gregory opened his door, and Princeton emerged into a cacophony of camera clicks and shouted questions. He offered his practiced smile, the one that graced magazine covers and boardrooms alike. "Mr. Harvey, over here." "Princeton, a word about the merger." "Mr. Harvey, who are you wearing tonight?" He navigated the gauntlet with practiced ease, offering sound bites like breadcrumbs. Inside, the great hall had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across marble floors, while New York's elite circulated like exotic fish in a very expensive pond. "Princeton, darling." Miranda Vale, a banking heiress he'd briefly dated 2 years ago, air-kissed his cheek. "You're looking devastatingly handsome as always." "Miranda." He kissed her hand, the gesture automatic. "The Bulgari collection suits you." Her diamonds caught the light, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Another player in their endless game of wealth and influence. He made his way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and business cards. Each conversation was a dance he'd performed countless times. A compliment here, a subtle business reference there, promises of lunch meetings that would never materialize. The champagne flowed, but he held the same glass all evening, another trick his father had taught him. "Stay sharp while they get sloppy, son." The evening seemed destined to be another forgettable parade of wealth and pretense until the moment Sabine Odette stepped onto the small stage erected near the Temple of Dender. The usual murmur of conversation continued for a moment before slowly dying away, like a wave receding from shore. She commanded attention, not through volume or dramatics, but through presence. Her burgundy gown caught the light like liquid fire, the color a defiant departure from the sea of safe black and neutral tones surrounding her. But it was her eyes that held Princeton captive, fierce, intelligent, and utterly unimpressed by the wealth surrounding her. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice carried clearly, touched with an accent he couldn't quite place. "We're not here tonight for mere charity. We're not here to ease our consciences with tax-deductible donations. We're here because in this city of endless wealth and opportunity, women are sleeping in subway stations with their children. They're choosing between medication and meals. They're staying in abusive relationships because they can't afford to leave." The room shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual charitable speech, filled with gentle appeals and gratitude for generosity. This was a challenge, wrapped in grace, but sharp as a blade. The Women's Haven Project isn't asking for your pity. We're offering you an opportunity, a chance to be part of real, lasting change. Not through handouts, but through empowerment. Not through charity, but through opportunity. Princeton found himself moving closer to the stage, drawn by something he couldn't name. She spoke about employment programs, education initiatives, and mental health support. But it was the steel in her voice that captivated him. This woman wasn't begging for crumbs from the wealthy's table. She was demanding they recognize their duty to humanity. As she concluded, the applause was scattered at first, then grew. Not the usual polite acknowledgement of these events, but something real, something sparked by the fire she'd ignited in the room. Princeton watched as she stepped down from the stage, noting how she moved through the crowd, graceful but purposeful, accepting congratulations but never simpering. He intercepted her path near the champagne fountain, offering a fresh glass. Compelling speech, Ms. Odette. Though you might have alienated half your potential donors. She accepted the champagne but didn't drink. Quality over quantity, Mr. Harvey. I prefer donors who understand our mission, not just our tax benefits. Her eyes met his directly. Your reputation precedes you, the man who treats hearts like hostile takeovers. And yours precedes you, Ms. Odette, the warrior queen of women's rights who never gives an inch. He smiled, the one that usually melted resistance. Though I'm curious why someone so opposed to the wealthy elite chooses to court their support. I don't oppose wealth, Mr. Harvey. I oppose the way it blinds people to their humanity. She set down her untouched champagne. Tell me, when was the last time you looked at your empire and saw people instead of profits? The question struck harder than he expected. Business is business, Ms. Odette. Sentiment leads to bankruptcy. Is that what you tell yourself at night, in that penthouse above the clouds? Her smile held no warmth. How interesting that the higher men like you climb, the harder it becomes to see the ground. Before he could respond, she was gone, moving through the crowd like a flame dancing away from his grasp. Princeton watched her go, aware of an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, something between irritation and intrigue. For the first time in years, someone had looked past his wealth, his power, his carefully constructed facade, and found him wanting. He spent the remainder of the evening in a strange state of distraction. The usual conversations felt hollow, the practiced smiles more false than ever. His thoughts kept returning to Sabine Odette's words, to the fire in her eyes when she spoke about her cause. It was more than passion. It was purpose, something his life had been lacking for longer than he cared to admit. As his car glided home through the quiet streets, Princeton found himself opening his tablet, searching for information about the Women's Haven Project. The organization's website was simple but powerful. Stories of women who had rebuilt their lives, statistics about domestic violence and homelessness, clear explanations of their programs and needs. Back in his penthouse, he stood at the same window where his evening had begun. The city sparkled below, but now he found himself wondering about the shadows between the lights, the stories hidden in the darkness. Sabine Odette's voice echoed in his mind. How interesting that the higher men like you climb, the harder it becomes to see the ground. Princeton Harvey had never backed down from a challenge, had never met a force he couldn't charm by or bend to his will. But as he stared at his reflection in the darkened glass, he had a feeling that everything was about to change. The warrior queen of women's rights had thrown down a gauntlet, and for the first time in his life, his money might not be enough to win the game. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I need you to set up a meeting with the board of the Women's Haven Project and find out everything you can about Sabine Odette. The night air carried the distant sounds of the city, sirens, music, the endless pulse of life below. Princeton Harvey, master of the financial universe, stood in his tower of success and felt for the first time in years truly awake. The game was about to change, and he wasn't entirely sure he knew the rules anymore. Chapter 2. The Proposition. The Metropolitan Museum's balcony offered temporary escape from the suffocating pleasantries within. Princeton loosened his bow tie, letting the cool night air wash over him. The city sprawled before him like a carpet of stars, each light a testament to the empire he'd built. Yet tonight, the view felt different, tainted by words that wouldn't leave his mind. He hadn't expected to find her here. Sabine Odette stood at the balcony's edge, a solitary figure bathed in moonlight. Her burgundy gown caught the gentle breeze, the fabric dancing like liquid shadow. She hadn't acknowledged his presence, but the slight tension in her shoulders told him she was aware of his approach. Escaping your admirers? His voice carried across the space between them, smooth as aged whiskey. "More like escaping the pretense," she replied without turning. "It gets thick in there, doesn't it? All that wealth trying to convince itself it has a conscience." Princeton moved to stand beside her, maintaining a careful distance. Up close, he could detect the subtle scent of jasmine, a fragrance far more delicate than the overwhelming perfumes favored by his usual social circle. "You seem quite comfortable passing judgment on people you barely know." Now she did turn, and the moonlight caught the planes of her face, highlighting cheekbones that could have graced magazine covers. But it was her eyes that held him, dark, intelligent, and completely unimpressed by his presence. "I know enough," she said. "I know that in there, they're discussing whether to donate to our shelter the same way they discuss which summer house to buy. I know that tomorrow they'll pat themselves on the back for their generosity while spending more on lunch than they gave to help women in crisis. And yet you're here, asking for their help." He leaned against the balustrade, studying her profile. "Isn't that a bit hypocritical?" "No more hypocritical than you pretending to care about charity while calculating the PR benefits." Her words carried no anger, just a steady certainty that pricked at his carefully maintained composure. The night air shifted between them, carrying the distant sounds of the city, sirens, traffic, the eternal rhythm of Manhattan life. Princeton found himself searching for his usual smooth responses, the practiced lines that had never failed him before. "Let me take you to dinner," he suggested, the words falling from his lips with practiced ease. "I'm interested in discussing potential investments in your organization." Sabine turned fully toward him now, and a smile played at her lips. Not the warm, inviting smiles he was accustomed to receiving, but something more complex, tinged with an awareness that made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. "Are you always this transparent, Mr. Harvey?" She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "Or am I special? I prefer direct approaches. They tend to be more efficient." Efficient. She tasted the word like a fine wine, finding it wanting. "Is that how you view everything, in terms of efficiency and return on investment?" "In my experience, it's the most honest way to approach any situation." "Honest?" Now she laughed, a sound both musical and cutting. "Hearts aren't corporations, Mr. Harvey. They don't bounce back from hostile takeovers. They can't be bought, sold, or traded on your precious stock exchange." Something in her words struck deeper than he'd expected, finding a crack in his armor he hadn't known existed. "You've made quite a few assumptions about me, Ms. Odette." "Have I?" She stepped closer still, her presence commanding his full attention. "Tell me then, when was the last time you pursued someone who couldn't advance your social or business interests? When was the last time you looked at a woman and saw a person instead of an acquisition?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications he wasn't prepared to examine. Princeton straightened, adjusting his cuffs, a nervous gesture he thought he'd eliminated years ago. "You're very quick to cast me as the villain in your narrative," he said, his voice carrying an edge he hadn't intended. "Have you considered that perhaps I'm genuinely interested in your work?" "Oh, I believe you're interested." Sabine's voice softened, but the steel beneath remained. "The question is whether you're interested in our mission, or in adding another conquest to your collection. I've done my research, Mr. Harvey. Your pattern with women is as predictable as your business strategies. Identify, pursue, acquire, and discard." Her words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Princeton felt his carefully constructed facade crack slightly, letting something real slip through. "And what if I told you this time was different?" "I'd say you probably tell them all that." She turned back to the city view, but her words continued to cut. "You know what's truly sad? I think you actually believe it each time. The great Princeton Harvey, so convinced of his own charm that he can't tell the difference between conquest and connection anymore. The silence that followed felt charged with unspoken challenges. Princeton found himself studying her profile, noting the strength in her jaw, the subtle defiance in her posture. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the manufactured way he was used to. Her beauty carried substance, character, a force of will that both attracted and unsettled him. "Have dinner with me," he said again, but this time the words came out different, less smooth, more real. Not to discuss investments or make propositions, just dinner. Sabine turned back to him, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You don't know how to do just dinner, Mr. Harvey. Everything's a transaction to you. Even this conversation. You're standing there calculating angles, planning approaches, thinking about how to turn this into a win. You seem very certain about who I am. I'm certain about who you've chosen to be." She gathered her clutch, preparing to leave. "But I wonder sometimes if you remember who you were before the money and power became your personality." She moved to pass him, then paused. "You want to impress me, Mr. Harvey? Do something that doesn't benefit you. Help someone who can't advance your interests or enhance your image. Show me the man you might have been instead of the empire you've become." The scent of jasmine lingered as she walked away, leaving Princeton alone on the balcony. He turned back to the city view, but the lights seemed dimmer now, the empire he'd built suddenly feeling hollow. His phone buzzed. Another merger update, another deal to close, another victory to add to his collection. For the first time in years, he let it ring unanswered. Sabine's words echoed in his mind, "Show me the man you might have been, instead of the empire you've become." The night air carried a chill now, or perhaps it was the uncomfortable weight of self-reflection. Princeton Harvey, master of the financial universe, stood alone on a balcony, realizing that for all his wealth and power, he'd just been thoroughly defeated by the one thing he couldn't control or acquire: the truth. He pulled out his phone, bypassing the missed calls and messages, and opened a browser. The Women's Haven Project's website glowed on his screen, and he found himself reading about their programs, their successes, their needs. Not scanning for business opportunities or PR angles, but actually reading, actually seeing. Something was changing, shifting beneath the surface of his carefully constructed world. Sabine Odette had done more than reject his proposition. She'd held up a mirror he couldn't look away from. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Princeton Harvey wasn't sure he liked what he saw reflected back. The sounds of the gala drifted through the balcony doors. Laughter, music, the familiar symphony of wealth and privilege. But tonight it all seemed different, as if Sabine's words had altered the frequency of his world. He straightened his bow tie, but the gesture felt mechanical now, part of a costume he'd worn for so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't his real skin. As he prepared to return to the party, a thought struck him. When was the last time he'd done something simply because it was right, not because it benefited him? The question followed him back into the glittering crowd, a persistent whisper in his mind that wouldn't be silenced by champagne or social niceties. The game had changed, but he wasn't sure he knew the new rules. For the first time in his adult life, Princeton Harvey felt like he was losing. And strangest of all, a part of him welcomed the defeat. Chapter 3. The Challenge. The Harvey Industries boardroom embodied power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan, while the gleaming mahogany table stretched like a runway of authority. Princeton sat at its head, watching Sabine Odette command the space as if she owned it. Her charcoal gray suit was a far cry from the burgundy gown of the gala, but she wore it with the same regal confidence. "The Women's Haven Project isn't just a shelter," she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. We're a comprehensive rehabilitation and empowerment program. Last year alone, we helped 78 women transition from crisis to independence. 34 of them now run their own businesses. Princeton studied her presentation with practiced indifference, though his mind kept returning to their encounter on the balcony 3 nights ago. She'd traded her evening makeup for a more subtle look, but her eyes still held that same fierce intelligence that had first caught his attention. "Impressive statistics," he interrupted, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "But you're asking for $5 million to expand a shelter that serves, what, 50 women at most? The numbers don't add up, Ms. Odette." The board members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to their CEO being so directly confrontational in pitch meetings. But Sabine didn't flinch. "Each woman we help impacts at least 5 others in her network. Children, family, community. But you'd know that if you looked beyond spreadsheets." She advanced her presentation slide. "These are real people, Mr. Harvey, not entries in a ledger. Numbers don't lie, Ms. Odette." "No, but they don't tell the whole truth either." She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. The gesture wasn't aggressive, but it commanded attention. "Tell me, Mr. Harvey, have you ever spent a night wondering where your next meal would come from? Ever had to choose between feeding your children and paying rent?" The boardroom grew tense. Princeton rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. "My office, now!" He could feel his board members' eyes following them as he led Sabine down the corridor. His corner office was even more impressive than the boardroom, 3 walls of glass offering panoramic views of the city he'd conquered. Art pieces worth millions adorned the walls, each one carefully selected to project power and success. "That was quite a performance," he said, closing the door, "though antagonizing the board might not be the best fundraising strategy." Sabine stood in the center of his office, unintimidated by the trappings of wealth surrounding her. "I'm not here to perform, Mr. Harvey. I'm here because women's lives are at stake." "Everything's life and death with you, isn't it?" He moved to his desk, a massive piece of Italian marble that had required special engineering to install. No room for nuance or negotiation. When you've held a woman's hand while she decides whether to leave her abuser, when you've watched children sleep in subway stations because their mother can't afford rent, yes, everything becomes that clear. She approached his desk, her reflection ghosting across its polished surface. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you? From up here, people probably look like ants." Princeton felt that familiar crack in his armor, the one her words seemed uniquely able to create. "You think you have me all figured out, don't you? I think you've forgotten what it means to be human." She glanced around his office, taking in the obvious displays of wealth. "All of this. It's like armor you've built around yourself. But armor doesn't just keep things out, Mr. Harvey. It also traps you inside." He moved to the window, looking down at the city below. "You've made your point, Ms. Odette. Multiple times, in fact. But emotional appeals don't change financial realities." "Then let me propose something different." She stepped closer, her reflection joining his in the glass. "Spend 1 week in our shelter. No escape clause, no golden parachute. See what real strength looks like." He turned to face her, finding her closer than expected. "And what would that prove? That there are things in this world money can't fix, and people it can't buy." Her eyes held his, unflinching. 7 days, Mr. Harvey. Live among them, work alongside them. Then tell me our program isn't worth every penny. You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about this work." She took another step closer, close enough that he could detect that familiar hint of jasmine. "What's wrong? Afraid to step out of your tower? Afraid you might actually feel something?" Princeton moved to put his desk between them, needing the physical barrier. "And if I refuse, then you've proven exactly what kind of man you are." She gathered her presentation materials. a man who hides behind his money because he's forgotten how to face reality without it. You're asking me to waste a week of my time to prove a point. No, I'm offering you a chance to remember who you were before all this became your identity. She gestured to the office. When was the last time you did something that actually mattered, Mr. Harvey? Something that changed lives instead of stock prices? The question hit him harder than he wanted to admit. I change lives every day. I create jobs, drive innovation. From a safe distance, she interrupted, through intermediaries and initiatives and tax-deductible donations. When was the last time you looked someone in the eye and really saw them, really helped them? Princeton found himself at his bar cart, pouring a drink he didn't really want. You have a remarkable talent for making success sound like a character flaw. Success isn't the flaw. It's what you've let it do to your humanity. She moved to the door, then paused. 1 week, Mr. Harvey. 7 days to prove me wrong about you. Or are you afraid I might be right? The challenge hung in the air between them. Princeton took a sip of his scotch, buying time. And if I do this, if I spend a week slumming it at your shelter, then maybe you'll understand why we need that 5 million. Maybe you'll see that some investments can't be measured in quarterly returns. She turned back to face him. But more than that, maybe you'll remember what it feels like to be more than your bank account. You really believe a week can change someone that fundamentally? I believe you're not as far gone as you pretend to be. Her voice softened slightly. I've seen glimpses, you know. Moments when the armor cracks and something real shows through. The question is whether you're brave enough to let those cracks widen. Princeton set down his untouched drink. And if I prove you wrong, if I spend a week at your shelter and still don't see things your way, then at least you'll have tried something real for once. She opened the door. Think about it, Mr. Harvey. But don't take too long. While you're up here contemplating, women are making choices no one should have to make. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Princeton alone in his monument to success. He returned to the window, looking down at the city that had made him rich. Somewhere down there, beyond the gleaming towers and luxury boutiques, people were struggling just to survive. He'd known this abstractly, of course, but Sabine Odette had a way of making abstract concepts feel uncomfortably real. His phone buzzed. Another merger update, another deal to close. But for the first time in his career, the thrill of conquest felt hollow. Her words echoed in his mind. When was the last time you did something that actually mattered? Princeton Harvey had built his empire by never backing down from a challenge. But this was different. This wasn't about money or power or winning. This was about something he'd forgotten how to measure. Humanity. He pressed his intercom. Janet, get me everything we have on the Women's Haven project and clear my schedule for next week. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of promise and possibility. In his reflection, Princeton saw something he hadn't noticed in years: uncertainty. And somehow, it felt like the beginning of something important. Chapter 4. The Descent. The Women's Haven project stood in stark contrast to Princeton's usual domain. The 4-story brick building wore its age without apology, its windows clean but weathered, its steps worn smooth by countless journeys of desperation and hope. His Italian leather shoes felt absurdly out of place as he climbed those steps, carrying a small duffel bag containing the most basic clothes his assistant could find at short notice. Sabine waited in the entrance, her expression neutral, but her eyes holding a hint of surprise. I honestly wasn't sure you'd come. I always keep my word, Princeton replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, stripping away the flattering ambience he was accustomed to. We'll see about that. She gestured for him to follow. First rule: no phones, no tablets, no connection to your empire. You're here to experience reality, not manage it from a distance. Princeton hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where his phone usually resided. He'd left it with his assistant, along with strict instructions about emergencies, but its absence felt like missing a limb. Having second thoughts already. Sabine's voice carried a challenging edge. Instead of responding, he followed her down a corridor that had seen better days. The walls were painted an institutional shade of beige, but someone had tried to brighten them with hand-painted murals, flowers, birds, messages of hope in multiple languages. "This will be your room." Sabine opened a door to reveal a space barely larger than his office bathroom. A narrow bed, a metal dresser, and a small desk occupied most of the available space. "The counselor who usually uses it is on leave. You'll be close enough to hear if there's a crisis during the night." "Cozy," Princeton remarked, trying to mask his discomfort with sarcasm. "More space than some of our residents had in their last safe place." Sabine's words cut through his defense mechanism. "Drop your bag and I'll introduce you to some of the women. But first, your tie has to go, and that watch probably costs more than our monthly operating budget." Princeton removed his Patek Philippe and silk tie, feeling strangely vulnerable without them. These small symbols of status had become such a part of him that their absence felt like surrendering armor before battle. The common room buzzed with activity. Women of various ages sat at tables, some working on laptops, others helping children with homework. The scene was both ordinary and extraordinary, lives being rebuilt one quiet moment at a time. "Everyone, this is Princeton," Sabine announced. "He'll be with us for a week, learning about our work." The responses ranged from indifference to outright suspicion. A teenage girl cradling an infant looked up, her eyes far older than her years. "I'm Maria," she said softly, "and this is Sophie." The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the struggles that had brought her to this place. "She's beautiful," Princeton offered, the words feeling inadequate. "She's why I'm alive." Maria's voice carried weight beyond her years. "Her father said he loved me, you know, right up until the moment I told him I was pregnant. Then I became a problem to be solved." Princeton felt the impact of her words like a physical blow. How many times had he used that same phrase, "a problem to be solved," in his boardroom? An elderly woman approached, her silver hair neatly styled despite her worn clothing. "Eleanor," she introduced herself. "Former high school teacher, current cautionary tale." "I'm sure that's not true," Princeton began, but she cut him off with a wave. 43 years of teaching, a comfortable pension, and a house I'd paid off." Her eyes held a mixture of pain and anger. "All gone because I trusted the wrong man with my heart and my finances. He was very charming, just like you, knew exactly what to say, exactly how to make me feel special." The accusation in her tone was unmistakable. Princeton found himself without his usual smooth responses. A voice from behind him cut through the awkward silence. "You're here to what? Save us." Elena, a woman in her 30s, stood with a mop in her hands. "We don't need another rich man's guilt project." Princeton turned to face her, noting the proud set of her shoulders despite her task. Without thinking, he moved to the supply closet, retrieved another mop, and began cleaning alongside her. The room fell silent. Even Sabine seemed surprised by his action. "You're doing it wrong," Elena said after a moment. "Long strokes, and don't forget to wring it out properly. We can't afford to waste cleaning supplies." For the next hour, Princeton Harvey, CEO of a global empire, learned how to mop floors properly. His expensive shirt grew damp with sweat, his carefully styled hair fell out of place, and his hands developed the beginning of blisters. But something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Maria began sharing more of her story as she rocked Sophie. "I was going to college, you know. pre-med, had a scholarship and everything. Then I met him at a party. He was older, successful, said all the right things. She paused, looking down at her sleeping daughter. Now I'm trying to figure out how to finish high school while keeping us both alive. Eleanor joined the conversation, settling into a worn armchair. At least you're young enough to start over. Try finding a job at 73 with no recent work experience and a credit score destroyed by someone you trusted. Their stories poured out, each one a testament to both human cruelty and resilience. A lawyer who'd lost everything fleeing an abusive judge husband. A restaurant owner whose partner had stolen her life savings and disappeared. A nurse whose addiction to prescribed pain medication had cost her her license and her home. Princeton listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in years. These weren't statistics or tax write-offs or PR opportunities. These were lives interrupted, dreams derailed, strength forged in crucibles he could barely imagine. As evening approached, he found himself in the shelter's small kitchen, helping prepare dinner. His knife skills were embarrassingly poor compared to Elena's practiced efficiency. "Never had to cook for yourself, have you?" she asked, demonstrating how to properly chop onions. "I have people for that," he admitted, then winced at how entitled it sounded. "Had people for that," Elena corrected. "For the next week, you're just Princeton. No empire, no servants, no escape hatch. Think you can handle it?" He caught Sabine watching him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I guess we'll find out." That night, alone in his sparse room, Princeton lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the shelter. Somewhere down the hall, a child was crying. Footsteps past his door, a late-night arrival seeking sanctuary. The city sounds were the same ones that reached his penthouse, but here they felt different, more immediate, more real. His hands ached from unaccustomed labor, his back protested the thin mattress, and his mind wouldn't stop replaying the stories he'd heard. Maria's lost scholarship, Eleanor's stolen retirement, Elena's fierce pride as she taught him to mop floors correctly. A text would bring his driver, a phone call would return him to his world of luxury and power. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Princeton Harvey felt something he'd forgotten how to feel, uncertainty about whether his way of life was really living at all. He drifted off to sleep as sirens wailed in the distance, his dreams filled with images of women rebuilding their lives, one small victory at a time, and of Sabine Odette's knowing eyes watching his own walls begin to crumble. Chapter 5. The Awakening. By day 3, Princeton's hands were raw from cleaning, his designer clothes forgotten in the small dresser drawer. He woke before dawn, his body adjusting to the shelter's rhythm rather than his usual luxurious late mornings. The thin mattress no longer felt like torture, and the sound of the shelter stirring to life had become oddly comforting. He made his way to the kitchen, where Elena was already preparing breakfast. Without a word, she handed him a cutting board and a pile of potatoes. His knife skills had improved under her exacting guidance, though she still clicked her tongue at his occasional clumsiness. "You're learning," she conceded, watching him dice with growing confidence. "Though I bet you never thought you'd be making breakfast for 20 people at 5 in the morning." 23, he corrected, surprising himself by knowing the exact number of current residents. "Maria and Sophie moved in yesterday evening, remember?" Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "Look who's paying attention." She paused in her work, studying him. "You're not exactly what I expected, you know." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd quit after the first blister, or who'd throw money at us to avoid actually working." She resumed chopping with practiced efficiency. "Instead, you're here every morning, doing the grunt work without complaining." Princeton concentrated on his potatoes, unsure how to respond. The truth was, he was surprising himself. Each day revealed something new, not just about the shelter and its residents, but about himself. The kitchen door swung open and Sabine entered, already dressed for the day in simple slacks and a blue blouse. She paused, taking in the scene before her. "You're not as good at hiding your heart as you think," she observed, finding Princeton focused intently on his task. The morning light filtering through the kitchen windows caught the silver threading through his dark hair, evidence of the sleep he'd sacrificed to be up this early. "Maybe I never wanted to hide it," he admitted, not looking up from his work. "Maybe I just forgot how to show it." The moment hung between them, fragile as morning mist. Elena busied herself with the stove, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. The day unfolded like the pages of a story Princeton hadn't known he was part of. He served breakfast, learning each resident's preferences without being told. Maria liked her potatoes extra crispy. Eleanor took her coffee black with 2 sugars. Little Sophie was starting to smile when he made funny faces while serving her mother. Later, he found himself in the shelter's small computer room, surrounded by women eager to learn basic office skills. His expertise, stripped of its corporate context, became a bridge rather than a barrier. "See, you just need to format the cells like this," he explained to Janet, a former nurse trying to rebuild her career. "Then Excel does the calculations automatically." "You make it sound so simple," she sighed, frustration evident in her voice. "Everything used to be simple, you know, before everything fell apart." Princeton paused, really looking at her. Janet's hands shook slightly as she typed, a remnant of her recovery journey. But her eyes were clear and determined. "Nothing worth doing is ever simple," he found himself saying. "But that doesn't mean it's impossible." The afternoon brought new challenges. A donation of office furniture needed to be moved in, and Princeton found himself sweating alongside the shelter's maintenance man, carrying desks up narrow stairs. "Mr. Big Shot's got some muscle under those designer clothes," Tony commented, watching Princeton navigate a particularly awkward corner. "Though you might want to wrap those hands. Blisters won't help anyone." Princeton looked down at his palms, red and raw from days of unaccustomed labor. A week ago, he would have considered such physical work beneath him. Now, each callus felt like a badge of honor, proof that he was finally doing something real. The sun was setting when Sabine found him in the small courtyard, teaching a group of women basic computer skills on laptops donated by local businesses. The golden light softened his features, and for a moment she saw past the businessman to the man beneath. "I didn't expect to find you still here," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Most of our volunteers don't stay this late." "I'm not most volunteers," he replied, helping Eleanor navigate a particularly tricky spreadsheet. "Besides, these women have jobs or interviews to prepare for. When else would they have time to learn?" Sabine watched as he patiently explained formulas and formatting, his usual commanding presence gentled into something more approachable. The women around him had relaxed, no longer seeing him as an intimidating figure from another world, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help. "You've changed," she observed later as they walked through the quiet halls doing evening checks. The shelter had a different energy at night, a peaceful hush that belied the struggles its residents faced. "Have I?" Princeton paused by a window, moonlight silvering his profile. "Or am I just remembering who I was before success became my identity?" "Both, maybe." Sabine moved to stand beside him, close enough to catch the faint scent of coffee and clean sweat that had replaced his usual expensive cologne. "You're good with them, you know, the women. You don't talk down to them or treat them like charity cases." "They're not charity cases," he said firmly. "They're people who've been dealt a bad hand, but are fighting to change their stories. They deserve respect, not pity." The words surprised them both with their intensity. Sabine turned to study him, really study him, in the gentle moonlight. "3 days ago, you were counting the cost per person of our program," she reminded him. "Now you're staying late to teach Excel classes and carrying furniture up 3 flights of stairs." 3 days ago, I was an idiot. who thought he understood the world from the top of a glass tower. Princeton ran a hand through his disheveled hair, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in his corporate persona. These women, their stories, they're changing how I see everything. A cry from down the hall interrupted their conversation. Sophie was having a rough night. Without hesitation, Princeton moved toward the sound, his steps sure and purposeful. He found Maria pacing with her fussy daughter, exhaustion evident in every line of her young face. "I'm sorry if she woke anyone," she started to apologize, but Princeton waved it away. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Sophie reached for him immediately. "She remembers you from breakfast," Maria explained, watching in amazement as her usually fussy daughter settled against Princeton's shoulder. "She likes your silly faces." Princeton began a gentle, swaying motion, humming a half-remembered lullaby his own mother used to sing. Sophie's eyes grew heavy, her small body relaxing into sleep. From the doorway, Sabine watched the scene unfold. This was not the Princeton Harvey who had challenged her funding request in his boardroom. This man, cradling a baby with infinite gentleness while her teenage mother finally sat down to rest, was someone else entirely. Sometimes, she thought, watching him carefully transfer the sleeping Sophie back to her crib, people surprise you in the most beautiful ways. Later that night, as Princeton lay on his narrow bed listening to the shelter's nighttime sounds, he realized something profound. His hands hurt, his back ached, and his designer clothes were gathering dust. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. His phone sat unused in his penthouse office, his empire running without him, and somehow the world hadn't ended. Instead, it had expanded, grown richer and more complex. Every woman in the shelter had a story that deserved to be heard, a dream that deserved support, a future that could be transformed with the right help. And Sabine, her presence was like a compass, constantly challenging him to find his true north. She moved through the shelter with grace and purpose, tough when needed, but infinitely gentle with the broken spirits in her care. As sleep finally claimed him, Princeton realized he was no longer counting the days until his week would end. Instead, he was counting the moments until morning, when he could return to this work that was slowly but surely awakening his heart. Chapter 6. The Crisis. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the shelter's windows when the news arrived. Sabine stood in her tiny office, phone pressed to her ear, her normally composed face betraying shock and dismay. Princeton, passing by with a stack of clean towels, caught the change in her expression and paused. "How can they do this without warning?" Her voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. "We have women here who depend on... Yes, I understand budget constraints, but... No, please, just let me..." She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it as if it had personally betrayed her. "What's wrong?" Princeton set down the towels, closing the office door behind him. "The state funding. They're cutting it. Effective immediately." Sabine sank into her chair, the weight of responsibility visible in every line of her body. 30% of our operating budget gone with one phone call. Princeton's hand instinctively moved to reach for his checkbook, but Sabine caught the gesture and shook her head. "Money alone won't save us," she insisted, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We need sustainable change, not a temporary fix." "Let me help," he started, but she cut him off. "By throwing money at the problem? That's the old Princeton talking." She stood, pacing the small space. "We need real solutions, long-term answers. These women deserve more than a band-aid on a bullet wound." For the first time in his professional life, Princeton felt truly helpless. His usual tools, money, influence, power, seemed inadequate in the face of this crisis. He watched Sabine move restlessly around her office, noting how the morning light caught the tension in her shoulders. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. "Not what you think I can give, but what you actually need." She stopped pacing, turning to face him. The vulnerability in her expression struck him deeply. "We need jobs, real jobs, not just entry-level positions. We need companies willing to look past gaps in resumes and understand that domestic violence survivors might have spotty work histories. We need affordable childcare so mothers like Maria can work without spending their entire paycheck on babysitters. We need healthcare," Princeton finished, remembering Janet's struggle to find work without current certifications. Professional development opportunities, a chance to rebuild, not just survive. Sabine studied him, something shifting in her gaze. "You're really listening, aren't you?" "I'm learning to." He moved closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of coffee and lavender that he'd come to associate with her. "Give me your phone." Princeton ... "Trust me." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her phone in it. For the next hour, Princeton Harvey put his empire to work in a way he never had before. He called board members not to ask for donations, but to create opportunities. He reached out to HR departments, education programs, childcare centers. His voice carried the authority of wealth, but spoke the language of humanity he'd learned in the past few days. "No, Tom, I don't want you to write a check," he said to his oldest board member. "I want you to create a program, professional re-entry for survivors of domestic violence. Yes, it'll cost more than a donation. That's the point." By mid-morning, the small office was covered in notes and ideas. Sabine watched in amazement as Princeton, his sleeves rolled up and his designer stubble catching the light, built something entirely new. "Here's what we can do," he explained, pointing to his rough sketches. "Create a network of partner companies committed to second-chance hiring. Set up a childcare cooperative using existing community resources. Establish a healthcare partnership with local clinics. It's not just about money, it's about building infrastructure. This is..." Sabine traced the plans with her finger, her other hand unconsciously gripping Princeton's arm. "This could actually work." "It will work," he assured her, hyper-aware of her touch, "because we're not just throwing money at symptoms anymore. We're treating the cause." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Princeton found himself noticing details he'd been trying to ignore. The flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the subtle curve of her lips, the strength and grace that seemed to radiate from her very being. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Elena entered, carrying Sophie while Maria trailed behind, clearly distressed. "Her fever's getting worse," Elena reported, "and the clinic downtown has a 3-hour wait." Before Sabine could respond, Princeton was already pulling out his phone, the first time he'd used it since arriving at the shelter. "Doctor? Sarah? Yes, it's Princeton Harvey. I need a favor." He gestured for Maria to bring Sophie closer. "I have an infant with a fever. No, not mine, a friend's. Can you..." "Yes, I understand you're busy. Name your price." "Princeton," Sabine started to object, but he held up a hand. "Sometimes," he said softly, "money isn't evil. Sometimes it's just a tool to help people who need it." Within an hour, Sophie was being examined by one of the city's top pediatricians who'd cleared her morning schedule after Princeton's call. But what struck Sabine wasn't the power of his name or his money. It was the way he held Sophie while the doctor examined her, the gentle way he explained everything to Maria, the human connection that no amount of wealth could fake. As they waited for Sophie's prescription, Sabine found herself studying Princeton in the harsh fluorescent light of the pharmacy. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his hands showing the marks of manual labor. Yet he'd never looked more attractive to her. "You're staring," he noted, not taking his eyes off Sophie, who was finally sleeping peacefully in his arms. "I'm observing," she corrected. "There's a difference. And what are you observing?" "That maybe I was wrong about you." She moved closer, ostensibly to check on Sophie, or at least wrong about who you could become. Princeton turned to face her, their proximity suddenly intense. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he admitted. "About money, about power, about what really matters." The pharmacy's overhead lights flickered, casting strange shadows, but in that moment both of them saw each other with perfect clarity. "We should get back to the shelter," Sabine said softly, though she made no move to step away. "There's still so much to do." "There's always more to do," Princeton agreed. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about fixing everything at once. Maybe it's about showing up day after day and doing what we can." They returned to the shelter to find Princeton's plans already taking shape. His assistant had been busy. Representatives from partner companies were scheduled to visit, childcare centers were being contacted, healthcare partnerships were being explored, but it was the small moments that struck him most deeply. Maria's grateful tears when Sophie's fever broke, Janet's pride in mastering Excel, Eleanor's quiet determination as she prepared for a job interview. That evening, as the shelter settled into its nighttime routine, Princeton found Sabine in the courtyard. She sat on a worn bench, her face turned up to the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. "Thank you," she said as he sat beside her. "Not for the money or the connections, but for seeing them, really seeing them. Thank you for showing me how." He hesitated, then added, "I used to think power meant being able to buy anything. Now I understand it's about being able to change things, to make a difference." Sabine turned to face him, moonlight painting her features in silver. "You're not the man I thought you were." "No," he agreed, acutely aware of her presence beside him. "I'm becoming someone else entirely." Above them, a star managed to shine through the city's glow, a reminder that light could penetrate even the darkest places. In the shelter behind them, women dreamed of better futures, children slept safely, and hope took root in the most unexpected ways. For the first time in his life, Princeton Harvey understood that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. It was measured in moments like these, in trust earned, in lives touched, in hearts awakened to possibilities they'd forgotten existed. The night air carried the sounds of the city, but here in this small courtyard, a different kind of music played. The quiet symphony of lives being rebuilt, of hearts learning to trust again, of a man discovering that his greatest strength lay not in his wealth, but in his capacity to care. Chapter 7. The Bridge. Princeton sat in the shelter's small conference room, his laptop open before him, but his attention was on the women gathered around the table. Gone was his power suit, replaced by a simple button-down shirt with rolled sleeves. His usual commanding presence had softened into something more approachable, more real. "The first thing to understand," he explained to the group, "is that your experiences, even the painful ones, have given you skills that companies need. Crisis management, adaptability, resilience. These aren't just buzzwords. They're strengths you've developed through survival." Janet, the former nurse, raised her hand hesitantly. "But the gaps in my employment history are part of your story, not the end of it." Princeton pulled up a presentation he'd spent the night creating. "We're partnering with companies that understand this. They're not looking for perfect resumes. They're looking for people who can overcome challenges." The door opened quietly, and Sabine slipped in. She leaned against the wall, watching Princeton work with the women. The change in him over the past few days was remarkable. The corporate shark had become a mentor, the ruthless CEO transformed into someone who truly cared. Harvey Industries will be leading by example, Princeton continued. We're implementing a second chance hiring program with flexible schedules and on-site childcare, but we're not stopping there. He clicked to the next slide, revealing a network of partner companies he'd assembled. Each logo represented hours of late-night calls, leveraging his influence not for profit, but for purpose. These companies have committed to more than just hiring. They're investing in you, professional development, mentorship programs, educational assistance. This isn't charity, it's investment in human potential. Elena, who'd been skeptical of Princeton from the start, studied the presentation carefully. And these companies won't discriminate against women with complicated backgrounds. They can't. Princeton's voice carried the authority of someone used to making things happen. It's written into the partnership agreements. Plus, they'll have to answer to me if they try. The room filled with cautious hope as Princeton outlined the program. Women who'd been told they were unemployable began to see possibilities. Mothers who'd thought their dreams were over started planning futures. Later, in the shelter's small kitchen, Sabine found Princeton making coffee. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, and she noticed the way his hands, once manicured to perfection, now showed signs of real work. "You're good at this," she said, reaching past him for a mug. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected current through both of them. "Building bridges between worlds. I'm learning from the best." He turned to face her, coffee forgotten. "You've been building these bridges for years, one life at a time." "Yes, but you've taken it to a scale I never could." She gestured toward the conference room, where women were still discussing their possibilities. "You're changing the system from within. We're changing it together." His voice softened. "I couldn't have done any of this without you showing me what really matters." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then Sophie's cry broke the spell, and they both moved instinctively toward the sound. They found Maria trying to calm her daughter while reviewing job applications on a borrowed laptop. Without a word, Princeton lifted Sophie into his arms, swaying gently while Maria continued her work. "You're getting good at that," Sabine observed, watching him with the baby. "She's an excellent teacher." Princeton smiled as Sophie grabbed his finger. "They all are. Every woman here has taught me something I should have known long ago." The afternoon brought a different challenge. Princeton's board had called an emergency meeting, concerned about the radical changes he was implementing. He attended virtually from the shelter's office, Sabine sitting quietly in support. "This is unprecedented," one board member protested, "dedicating resources to unproven employees." Unproven. Princeton's voice carried a new kind of authority, not the cold power of wealth, but the warm strength of conviction. "These women have proven themselves in ways you can't imagine. They've survived circumstances that would break most of us, and they're still fighting to build better lives." But the shareholders will benefit from a workforce that understands resilience, that knows how to overcome adversity. Princeton leaned forward, his intensity visible even through the video call. "We're not just doing the right thing, we're investing in human potential, and that always pays dividends." After the call, Sabine touched his arm gently. "You didn't have to put your reputation on the line like that." "Yes, I did." He covered her hand with his own. "Because you taught me that some things are worth fighting for." The evening found them in the courtyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of possibility. Princeton had spent the afternoon helping Janet prepare for a nursing recertification exam, then fixed a leaking sink in Eleanor's room. His expensive watch remained in his drawer, replaced by an awareness of time measured in moments of connection. "I had a dream last night," he confided, watching the colors fade from the sky. I was back in my penthouse, surrounded by all the trappings of success, but I felt completely alone. Then I woke up here, to the sound of Sophie crying and Elena singing in the kitchen, and I realized something. "What's that?" Sabine asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew. "That I've spent my life building walls when I should have been building bridges." He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "That true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you give." A gentle breeze carried the scent of the small herb garden some residents had started, a fragrant reminder of growth and renewal. Inside, they could hear the sounds of the shelter settling into its evening routine. Women sharing stories in the common room, children laughing, lives being rebuilt one moment at a time. "You're changing things," Sabine said softly. "Not just here, but in the whole system." "We're changing things," he corrected. "Every woman here is part of this transformation. I'm just providing tools they should have had access to all along." As if to prove his point, Janet burst into the courtyard, her face glowing with triumph. "I passed! The practice exam. I passed!" Princeton stood to congratulate her, and Sabine watched as he shared in Janet's joy with genuine warmth. This wasn't the same man who had walked into the shelter days ago, counting the cost per resident. This was someone who had learned to count in smiles, in victories, in lives transformed. Later that night, as Princeton reviewed more partnership proposals in his small room, he realized something profound. His empire hadn't crumbled in his absence, it had grown stronger, enriched by purpose rather than just profit. He was building something more valuable than wealth, a legacy of hope, a bridge between privilege and possibility. The night air carried the city's symphony through his window, but now he heard it differently. Each siren wasn't just noise, but a reminder of lives in crisis. Each distant laugh or cry represented a story waiting to be changed. And in the quiet moments between, he heard the steady drumbeat of his own heart, awakening to a different kind of success, one measured not in dollars, but in lives transformed. Chapter 8. The Connection. The shelter's office had grown cramped with stacks of paperwork, applications, program outlines, partnership agreements. Princeton and Sabine worked late into the evening, their dedication to the cause drawing them closer in unexpected ways. The small desk lamp cast a warm glow over their shared space, turning the mundane task of reviewing documents into something more intimate. "Look at these numbers," Sabine said, sliding a report across the desk. Their fingers brushed as Princeton reached for the paper, sending a subtle current through both of them. "The response from your partner companies has been overwhelming." Princeton wasn't looking at the numbers. Instead, he found himself studying the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in Sabine's eyes, how a strand of hair had escaped her usually pristine bun. She'd shed her professional armor hours ago, just as he had, both of them more comfortable in this shared mission than in their former roles. "It's not just my work," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "These companies are responding to the stories. Your stories. The women's stories." Sabine looked up, catching his gaze. The intensity she found there made her breath catch. "You've changed," she whispered. "You've shown me who I could be," he responded, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the shelter's nighttime sounds, distant conversations, the hum of the old heating system, the gentle rhythm of life continuing around them. Princeton found himself noticing details he'd been trying to ignore, the grace in Sabine's movements, the strength in her gentle hands, the way her presence had become as essential to him as breathing. Their working relationship had shifted subtly over the past days. The antagonism that had marked their first encounters had melted into something deeper, more meaningful. They moved around each other with an unconscious awareness, anticipating needs, completing thoughts. Do you remember, Princeton began, leaning back in his chair, that first night at the gala, when you accused me of treating hearts like hostile takeovers? Sabine smiled at the memory. You were different then, all polished surface and practiced charm. And you saw right through it. He stood, moving to the window where the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. You saw what I'd become, and you challenged me to remember who I was. Who you could be, she corrected, joining him at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, creating a single silhouette against the night sky. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Elena entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Her knowing smile suggested she'd noticed the atmosphere she'd walked into. "Thought you might need these," she said, setting down the cups. "It's going to be a long night with all these applications to review." "Thank you, Elena." Sabine accepted the coffee gratefully, but her eyes remained on Princeton's reflection in the window. After Eleanor left, they settled back into work, but something had shifted. Every shared glance carried new meaning. Every accidental touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. They worked in harmony, building something larger than themselves, not just programs and partnerships, but a bridge between their 2 worlds. "Listen to this," Princeton said, reading from an application. "Sarah Martinez, former executive assistant, fled with nothing but her children and the clothes they were wearing. Now she's teaching other women basic office skills while studying for her own degree." "She's amazing," Sabine agreed, moving to read over his shoulder. Her presence behind him was distracting, her warmth and subtle scent making it hard to focus on the words. "They're all amazing once they have the chance to show it." "You gave them that chance." Princeton turned in his chair, finding her closer than he'd expected. "You built this place, created this sanctuary. We're making it stronger together." Her hand rested on the back of his chair, inches from his shoulder. "Your vision combined with their courage, it's creating something extraordinary." The late hour and shared purpose had worn away their usual professional barriers. Princeton found himself studying her face in the gentle lamplight, seeing not just the dedicated director of the shelter, but the woman who had awakened his heart. "Tell me something," he said softly. "That first day, when you challenged me to spend a week here, did you really think I'd change, or were you just hoping to prove yourself right about me?" Sabine considered the question, moving to perch on the edge of the desk. The position brought her eye level with him, creating an intimacy that made her heart race. "I saw something in you," she admitted, behind the corporate armor and practiced smiles, something real, something worth awakening. "And now?" His voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "Now I see you." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than 1,000 elaborate speeches. The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility. Princeton stood slowly, drawn to her like gravity. Their proximity in the small office felt both dangerous and inevitable. A crash from the hallway shattered the moment. They rushed out to find Maria struggling with a box of donated clothes that had slipped from her grasp. "I'm sorry," she apologized, trying to gather the scattered items. "I couldn't sleep, thought I'd try to organize these." "Here, let me help." Princeton was already kneeling beside her, gathering clothes. Sabine joined them, and soon the 3 of them were sorting donations together, the late hour creating a strange intimacy in the quiet hallway. "You know," Maria said, folding a sweater with careful precision, "when you first came here, Mr. Harvey, I thought you were just another rich guy trying to ease his conscience." Princeton paused in his sorting. "And now?" "Now?" Maria smiled, glancing between him and Sabine. "Now I think you're exactly what this place needed. What we all needed." The simple observation carried layers of meaning. Sabine caught Princeton's eye over a pile of clothes, and something passed between them. Understanding, acknowledgement, possibility. They worked together until the donations were organized, their movements synchronized, their quiet conversation flowing naturally. It was well past midnight when they finally finished, but none of them felt tired. "Thank you," Maria said, as she prepared to return to her room. "Not just for this, but for everything, for seeing us as people, not problems." After she left, Princeton and Sabine found themselves alone in the hallway, surrounded by neatly organized boxes and something deeper than words. "We should get some rest," Sabine said, though she made no move to leave. "Probably," Princeton agreed, equally stationary. They stood in the quiet hallway, the shelter's nighttime sounds creating a gentle backdrop to the moment. The professional distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by something more real, more vulnerable. "Sabine," Princeton began, her name feeling different on his tongue in the midnight quiet. "I know," she replied, understanding all he hadn't said. They parted reluctantly, each to their separate rooms, but something had fundamentally changed. The connection between them had deepened beyond their shared mission, beyond their professional roles. In his small room, Princeton lay awake, listening to the shelter's gentle nighttime rhythm. His thoughts weren't